I want to talk about a filmmaker, not necessarily about a single film, but a filmmaker, and one that I respect because of his career. Tony Scott. Tony, for me, he was always willing to take chances. He was really about the craft, the artistry. And unlike his brother, who lately, in my opinion, has been phoning it in, and we'll see what's going to happen with Gladiator 2, but that's another story. Most of you guys know Tony Scott from Top Gun. That's what basically put him on the map, and that was back in '86. But if you really want to see where his creativity began, obviously it's in advertising, but it was a film in '83 called The Hunger. Now, The Hunger, such an underappreciated film about vampires questioning mortality. And it starts off with David Bowie, who's older, meeting a much younger doctor played by Susan Sarandon, and asking these questions about mortality and about blood and what could be done. But the way Tony directed that picture really stands out and still holds its own for what it was, talking about almost 40 years ago, right? It's a shame that he passed away in 2012. Both him and Tony and his brother Ridley, they came from advertising. Basically, if you saw a commercial back in the 80s and 90s, they had a hand in it. They did something about it. I mean, it was after Top Gun that Tony had so many options on the table, and he followed it up with Beverly Hills Cop 2. Now, he didn't do what Martin Brest did in the first one. He did something different. He looked at it more as a grittier action genre, but with the humor still. And that's exactly what he threw in there. And it's kind of funny because you're seeing that in the trailer for Beverly Hills Cop 4, which is coming out on Netflix, right? After Cop, Tony did an amazing picture called Revenge. That was in 1990. Another lesser-known film, but a really good film. And like you're talking about Kevin Costner, who's a retired fighter pilot, Anthony Quinn, who plays the leader of this drug cartel, and then his very young, beautiful wife, played by Madeline Stowe. Now, I encourage everybody to watch this film, but I encourage everybody to watch the director's version because it's brutal. I mean, with a title like Revenge, there's a reason why. Costner and Madeline decide to have an affair. They try to keep it behind them, secretly, but it doesn't work, man. And you don't necessarily want to sleep with your best friend's wife, especially when that friend is a drug fucking empire. Like, that's not a good move. But there's a lot of great scenes between the two of them, Anthony Quinn and Kevin Costner. Any guy who's watching this, you're going to love riding pants, man. Because when we first meet Madeline and she's walking along the side of a horse, she's wearing these riding pants, man. In that same year, Tony directed Days of Thunder. In my opinion, he phoned it in. I get it. It was basically Top Gun on wheels. That's all it was. It was very cliche. It was Tom Cruise. He was at his height, and he was just driving through. I'm telling you, the revenge story is what really put all of his, he put his creativity in that story. After the Days of Thunder, he did The Last Boy Scout in 91 with Bruce Willis and Damon Wayans, another buddy cop. It was also written by Shane Black of Lethal Weapon. In my opinion, you gotta have to argue every single year which is the better film, Lethal Weapon or Die Hard. And I mean, to me these days, I'm leaning towards Lethal Weapon. The way that story was written and the way it was directed by Richard Donner, that's a whole other story as well too. But it didn't work for a bunch of reasons on Last Boy Scout because of studio interference, man. I can't stand it. You had too many people who didn't understand the craft of storytelling, telling Tony what to do. So then it was just basically this bag of fucking marbles that was just thrown on the side of the road. That's done. And now Tony's hungry for something new, right? And all of a sudden he comes across this script by this nobody, a kid out of California that worked in a video store. And that nobody's name, back in the time, this is talking about the early 90s, right? He's talking about Quintin Tarantino. He wrote True Romance. Now, originally, he wanted to direct True Romance. And True Romance wouldn't be the film it is today if Quintin did it. It's the film it is today because of what Tony did. Tony saw that as a huge opportunity in 93 to really push certain things because so many things were done in the 80s. And now here he is pushing it again. Starring Christian Slater, Patricia Arquette, amazing picture, hit all the right beats. Tony, he's publicly said that it was the best script he ever came across. It was the best script that he ever directed. And for many reasons. You got to understand that back in 93, you're talking about people like Gary Oldman was playing a Jamaican drug dealer. Brad Pitt basically spent the entire film on a couch. You had James Gandolfini. He was tasked with recovering the drugs, and the interaction between him and Patricia Arquette are absolutely amazing. And then you can't forget one of the best scenes in cinematic history, which was between Dennis Hopper and Christopher Walken. He's talking about Sicily and the history of Sicily and where the Italian men actually came from. That scene basically makes that film. It sets the tone, and it becomes a perfect picture. After that, he did Crimson Tide in '95, his first collaboration with Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman. And the interaction between those two characters in a nuclear sub and that whole claustrophobic feel, he captured it really well. He followed that up with '96 with The Fan, Wesley Snipes and Robert De Niro. Another studio interference. Bullshit, because it could have been so much more. De Niro could have been so much more extreme, like Untouchables. He could have been that really, really crazy fucking fan. And they didn't let him do that, right? But he followed that up with Enemy of the State with Will Smith in '98. It was good. It showed us where technology was coming from and what's going to happen. Basically, everything's unfolding right now. And then after that, he did Brad Pitt and Robert Redford in Spy Game in 2001. It was good, but what was really important to notice is Tony knew he had opened up this amazing creative box again. And you could see he wanted to play with filmmaking again with that film. And he tried a few interesting things, and then he really pushed it in 2004 with Man on Fire. Now, Man on Fire is a remake. And funny enough is back in '87, Tony was passed over to do the original version of Man on Fire that stars Scott Glenn, that's set up in Italy, not in Mexico. But then all of a sudden, here you go, fast forward to 2005, and he's doing this version, which is an updated version, which the original is good. Trust me, it is good. Scott's great in it, and it's a different take on that same story. But the Mexican one and what he did regarding the technology and the filmmaking style and everything, he got you in there. He sucked you in to every single character, what was happening. That was amazing about that story. It was refreshing. It was ballsy. It was energetic. It brought us back to what filmmaking used to be and what it meant. Unfortunately, most filmmakers these days, they're not trying shit. Tony, I think, was the last one. And outside of a couple that I'll mention later on, majority of filmmaking that's done today is by committee. So following that, he did Domino, another great bounty hunter story. Very young Keira Knightley, Mickey Rourke, and also Edgar Ramirez. Like, just the tone of that was amazing. That was in '05. Followed it really quickly with Deja Vu, another film with Denzel Washington in '06. There's a scene in there that will blow your mind where he's basically revealing two timelines, 4.5 days apart from each other. And it's done perfectly. You wonder how he can tell a story like that. And he can because he's been practicing to tell these stories. That's what's fascinating about it. Then his last two films were about trains. A remake of Taking Pelham 1, 2, 3 with Denzel Washington again and John Travolta. It was good. It was clever. It was a compliment to the original back in '74 with Walter Matthau and Robert Shaw in those same roles. And then after that, he followed it with Unstoppable in 2010 with Denzel again. And it was with Chris Pine. And it was about a runaway train. So now it's been 14 years since he passed. And you have to wonder what Top Gun Maverick would have been like if he was still alive and would have done it. Because Tom Cruise has said over and over that he only ever wanted to do it with Tony Scott. But unfortunately, he passed away. And so then they ended up going with Joseph Kosinski, and he did a great job. It was amazing. Like, I still think that Top Gun Maverick is a near-perfect film, but I still wonder what could it have been if Tony actually handled it. So you got to understand that Tony, he always reinvented himself. He always looked at certain things and techniques, and he's always trying new ideas. In the 90s, he reinvented himself with True Romance. In the 2000s, he reinvented himself with Man on Fire. 2010, he did it again. You got to wonder, in 2010, was he ready to reinvent himself again? And he was still young enough to still be making films, and he probably would have reinvented himself again in 2020s. But we're never going to see that because you got filmmakers today that don't have the balls to try, challenge. They don't care about technically pushing certain envelopes. Like, you see certain techniques that are being thrown to the side, and they're not being encouraged to try again over and over and over. And this is what I miss. And to really get a sense of Tony Scott's advertising days, just search YouTube for BMW films back in the early 2000s, and also his other short film called Agent Orange. And you'll see these short films that BMW decided to pump a lot of money into, and they had such a response because of the storytelling that was going on and the techniques that he was doing, and other filmmakers that are there. There's a lot of filmmakers there that I respect that did those short films, and I actually have a copy of all of the films. I was fortunate enough to get a copy of it. But if you want to ask me, like, which is the one true Tony Scott film, it's hard. It's hard for me to say that there's one. But I would have to say True Romance. True Romance is a perfect picture. Followed by Revenge, I think, is a perfect picture. I think The Hunger is an amazing picture. I think Man on Fire, Domino, Deja Vu. I think you get the idea of where his films were headed and what they were doing. And it's a shame that nobody's doing that and pushing it. We need more pushing, man, because lately I see a few seconds of anything new and I'm not even interested in watching it because I don't see anything interesting. Such a shame.